Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Chief of Public Services here at the Pratt Library State Library Resource Center. During the month of November, we have been celebrating the 20th anniversary of the African American Department here at the Central Branch. So you could also please follow the Pratt Library on Instagram, our webpage, and the Compass newsletter for all upcoming library programs. And this evening, this program is one of the programs that we have in celebration of the 20th anniversary. At the end of the program, we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And also we have books on sale in the hallway by Urban Reads. So this evening, I am pleased to introduce our guest author, Kevin Woodson, law professor, sociologist, and former attorney. Before coming to Richmond Law, Kevin Woodson was an associate professor at the Thomas R. Klein School of Law at Drexel University in Philadelphia, where his scholarship focused on employment discrimination, racial diversity in higher education and the professions, and education reform. His works have appeared in Fordham Law Review, Cardozo Law Review, and Georgia Law Review, amongst other venues. Woodson was an associate at Wilmer, Cutler, Pickering, Hale, and Dorr in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in sociology and social policy from Princeton University, his JD from Yale Law School, and his BA from Columbia University. Woodson's latest book, The Black Ceiling: How Race Still Matters in the Elite Workplace, will be discussed this evening as he shares his thoughts on workplace inequity and the many obstacles that Black professionals have faced throughout their careers. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Woodson to the Pratt Library.
Thank you, everyone. This is, as I've been explaining, this is actually my first time giving an in-person talk for this book. And it's just really exciting to be here. I'm actually at a loss for words already, which is bad because I have 45 minutes to get through. But the words usually come back to me eventually. But thank you so much for showing up and coming to listen to what I have to say about this book. I hope you find it interesting. I hope you buy a copy, but more importantly, I hope that what I say here actually challenges the way that you think about some of these issues, gives you something to think about, and maybe something to change, a way to help make progress or help other people make progress in their lives. So I'm nervous about messing up the slide order here, but as you can see from the title of the book and the subtitle and the image on the cover, this book is really about a very specific group of people, but I think it has implications for a much broader group of people. So the book itself is based on my research, which focuses on the experiences of Black professionals, that's attorneys, investment bankers, management consultants, who've worked at some of the largest and most prestigious firms in the country. And it really focuses on their experiences and tries to find a way to explain some of the subtle problems that they run into in these elite workplaces. And so I'll be talking about that over the next 45 minutes. But one thing I wanted to make clear was that this isn't a book that really focuses on the typical issues that come up in this context. So most of the material on this topic focuses on bias. You know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard or read about some of the studies on racial bias, implicit bias, racial discrimination. And what I wanted to do with this book was to find a way to expand the discourse and to identify other types of problems that are even more subtle and even more complex than bias. So this book intentionally focuses on a couple of problems that I refer to as racial discomfort. And I'll talk about them in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk briefly about two particular people that I interviewed. These are not their real names and those are not their real pictures, but they are real people. I guess you have to take my word for it. Deborah and Sandra, as I call them, were two women who seemed to have a whole lot in common, but they had very different professional experiences. And this was something that didn't surprise me a whole lot because of my own professional experiences, which I'll be talking about in just a couple of minutes. But Deborah and Sandra actually worked at the very same law firm. They had the same position there. They were generally the same seniority level. I think maybe Sandra had gotten there 10 months earlier or something along those lines, but pretty similar on paper. And even more so, they attended the same law school. So I didn't interview them. It was a complete coincidence. I didn't find one of them through the other, but they were people who, you know, went way back. And they even had a parent who had the same occupation. They each had a mother who was a teacher. So as far as these things go, you would look at these two people and say they have a lot in common. They're similarly situated, is what we might say as sociologists or as lawyers. And you might expect that they would have similar experiences. But in fact, they had very different career outcomes. So I'll talk about them briefly here. I open up the book talking about Deborah. So literally the first page of the book talks about some of Deborah's difficulties at her firm. And so Deborah's situation was one that's pretty subtle. You know, it's not like she had been fired. She hadn't been demoted. She hadn't even been threatened with either of the above. But she recognized that she was stuck. So she had been working at the firm for maybe about 4 years by the time that I interviewed her. And her career wasn't going anywhere. And this is really bad because at these firms, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this type of career structure, but these firms have what's called an up or out employment model, where if you don't advance after a certain period of time, it's expected or maybe even forced upon you that you have to leave. And so she's up against the clock and she knows it. And as you can imagine, that's very stressful. It's a very difficult place to be, especially if you don't have any options lined up elsewhere. So just imagine you have this great job. So at this point, she's making $3,000 a week. So she's doing very well. On paper, her life looks amazing. But she knows that she's not going to have this job much longer. And she has to figure out what to do about it, how to get on. She's still a very young person, still in her 20s at this point. And she has to figure out what's next and how to make it happen. And so the problem for Deborah was that she had not had the opportunity to develop what I refer to as career capital. And so career capital is basically a term I made up to describe all of the different types of resources you need to advance in your careers at these firms. And career capital it's a kind of abstract concept, but it refers to social capital, and that's a name for the relationships that you form with colleagues, with clients, with some of your peers and potential mentors and sponsors. It also refers to human capital, and that's a term that economists use to describe the skills that you gain from having certain experiences or certain exposure. So in other words, getting high quality assignments allows you to develop and demonstrate certain types of skills. That's human capital. And so there are other types of career capitals as well, as like reputational capital. And as you can imagine from the name, that just means getting a reputation as someone who does really good work again and again and can be expected to become a superstar in the future. And so Deborah did not have any of that. And Deborah is obviously a very impressive person, or she wouldn't have gotten this job in the first place. This is someone who went to college and law school and did very well, and well enough to land a job that's highly competitive. I don't mean to say that going to college and law school means you're impressive, but maybe it is, but I'm biased. But she did this and did a good enough job in those schools to land a very competitive position at this firm. And she just was having a rough time. And so surely enough, within a few months of our interview, she had left the firm. And within a few years, she was no longer a lawyer. So she couldn't find another position that she enjoyed enough, and she had had such a negative experience at the firm dealing with the stress and the frustration that she just decided to do something completely different. Sandra, on the other hand, had an amazing time at the firm. So I talk about Sandra maybe on page 7, page 8 of the book. Sandra, even though she looks very similarly situated to Deborah, actually got to the firm and just had an amazing experience. And she was clearly on the partner track. So she was someone who was considered a superstar by her colleagues, and everybody recognized that she was on her way to big things. Her name just rung out, and it was just understood among her peers that she was destined for partnership. And sure enough, maybe 2 or 3 years after our interview, she became a partner at the firm. And that was a very big accomplishment for her. This was a firm that did not have many Black women as partners. And so it was a really big deal. But Sandra had sort of the opposite of Deborah's experiences. Sandra got to the firm and immediately was able to impress people with her work performance. She got hooked up with some really powerful senior professionals who took a liking to her and helped advance her career. And she just had a great time. She had a great experience. She had no complaints about her personal experience. One thing I'll point out, though, is that she didn't have a post-racial, naive view of what life was like at the firm, though. So she recognized that race mattered for other people. So she felt that if you were not a top superstar at the firm, there was a really good chance that you wouldn't get the same benefit of the doubt as other people might get on their performances. Lots of young attorneys are still learning on the job. We try to teach in law school, but we can't teach them exactly what it means to be an actual lawyer. So you're bound to make mistakes, and people who make mistakes, in Sandra's view, could end up being penalized more than their white counterparts, for example. But nonetheless, Sandra had an amazing experience, and there's some good quotes about that in the book. But I wanted to start off by just giving you these 2 women and their accounts of life at their firm, just to show you the complexity of what's going on here. So the way that some prior writings have described life at these firms, you wouldn't know that people like Sandra existed. And I think that it's important to take both of them into account, because as I'll circle back later at the end of this talk, I'll explain, there are some interesting reasons why they had differences in outcomes that don't necessarily have to do with their skills or their talents or their abilities. And so this was me when I started doing this research. It's been a long time coming. It's been in the works. In all seriousness, I guess in the interest of time, I'll skip through my background. I just wanted to say, though, that I've always been interested in issues of race and the disadvantages that Black people experience in America. This is something that has interested me since childhood, hearing my family's story on my father's side of the family, about his stories about growing up in Jim Crow America, Jim Crow, Virginia, not far from where I teach right now. Attending segregated Black schools and not being able to go to the white part of the lake. And so getting that kind of history background from my family and just noticing how things were in my hometown. I was from a small town in New Jersey, which was primarily working class, lower middle class. But even within this small town, there were real obvious inequalities in terms of how well people were doing. And in the school system, for example, there was a lot of informal segregation in terms of who was in what class. So long story short, all this really interested me. I read a lot. I was one of those let's just say it. I was a nerd, and I read a lot outside of class. I really just tried to consume as much information as I could on this particular topic. But I was not at all interested in Black professionals at that point. And that's just because from my position in life, my worldview at the time, these people had made it. So I didn't have 17-year-old Kevin, I guess a little older than the kid in the picture, just didn't really care, wasn't that concerned about those specific types of problems. It seemed to be like what people refer to as first world problems, where, okay, maybe somebody's not being nice to you at work, so what? But eventually, life happened and I became a professional myself. And I went to law school, and then I went on to work at a very large law firm in Washington, D.C. And I got a different perspective on things. So in speaking with a lot of my friends and colleagues and acquaintances who were also professionals at very big firms, I started to it wasn't intentional, but I started to kind of gather data on how race was affecting people, and also how different people made sense of race. What is it that they're perceiving is going on? How do they perceive that they're being treated? Because often you don't really know for sure. You can sense it out using the information that's available, but you could get it wrong. Either way, you could think that somebody's being unfair to you because of race, or you could think that everything's great, but you don't know what you're missing out on. So in any event, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and this was a topic that came up quite a bit. And that really interested me because I didn't see that kind of diversity of perspectives that I was hearing from them represented in the research on this topic. So I really wanted to explore situations like Sandra and Deborah, where you have people who seem like they're in the same situation, but who just have such vastly different experiences and opinions. And so that's what led me to pursue this project when I went back to grad school to get a PhD. Oh, I should say, yeah, I was working as an attorney and decided it was not for me. Being an attorney, it's a great profession, and I encourage my students to be attorneys, not to go back to school like I did, but I knew my path. And so I went back to school intending to study this, but this was just one interest of many. So that's what kind of is the general background for this is I worked on this in a seminar class, and the paper that I produced was so well received, I was encouraged to make it a dissertation. Then I was encouraged to turn the dissertation into this book. So none of this was planned in advance, but here we are. And so I want to talk a bit about the research very briefly, and then I want to get more into the specific problems that I've been identifying and discussing in the book. So just to give you a brief overview, starting when I was in grad school, I interviewed approximately 150 people in total. And these were mostly 60 to 90-minute long interviews. A few of them were much, much longer than that, though. As you can imagine, some people had a lot to get off their chest. And these were informal life history style interviews, meaning I basically told people that I was going to be talking to them about their life stories and their perspectives on how race affected them, either growing up or as professionals in their careers. And I explained that I was seeking people who, no matter what their perspectives, no matter what their experiences, who would just be willing to talk to me. And to do this, I used what's referred to as a snowball sampling method, not to bore you with the social science jargon, but that's basically when you reach out to one person who fits the criteria, and then you have them refer you to other people who fit the criteria. And so eventually you have a chain of people, and you end up getting access to people who would have never given you the time of day if you just cold called them or sent them an email out the blue. But because somebody's vouching for you or vouching for your study, you end up being able to talk to a lot of people who otherwise would not be comfortable being candid about the role of race in their careers. So that's how I developed the kind of body of research that I used to write this book. And as I mentioned earlier, I focus on this concept that I refer to as racial discomfort. Again, just for the record, I want to make clear, I don't mean to suggest that racial discomfort is the only problem that people experience in these firms. But based on my interviews, it's probably this concept captures the most common problems and the most common complaints that I came across. But I want to be clear, even though racial discomfort can occur, it's separate and apart from discrimination. Some of the people I interviewed did indeed experience discrimination as well. They experienced microaggressions. They experienced situations involving racial bias on the part of some of their colleagues or clients. So I don't mean to dismiss that as a relevant concern, but for the reasons I explained earlier, I focus specifically on racial discomfort in this book. And so there are two different types of racial discomfort that I'm going to address in turn. The first one, and these are all terms that I made up, so don't feel bad if they don't look familiar. I'd be worried if they did look familiar, but stigma anxiety is one kind and social alienation is the other. And so I want to start with stigma anxiety. And the term stigma anxiety refers to, and this is the language I use in the book, the uneasiness and trepidation that many Black professionals experience in situations where they recognize that they are at risk of unfair treatment on the basis of race. So in other words, it really just means this is the concern and fear and anxiety that people experience when they are worried about the threat of discrimination. And so it could happen even if they aren't experiencing discrimination yet, but it's when they're in situations where they're concerned that discrimination is around the corner. And so for them, they're sort of in a no-win situation because on the one hand, they have to worry about discrimination. And on the other hand, as I'll explain in the next few slides, their attempts to avoid that discrimination can also harm their careers. So in other words, in some instances, you might be able to avoid one danger, but by doing that, you also undermine your ability to acquire the career capital that I described. So you make it harder for yourself to develop relationships, to get good assignments and that sort of thing. And so it's a very reasonable reaction to these situations, but it can be very costly. So it's very, very difficult, very, very frustrating and stressful for the people in this situation. And stress is actually the first way that this impacts Black professionals. And so it's easy to overlook stress and how important stress is as a problem, but there's a more and more research on just how dangerous stress is. You know, it kills people. And even in the short term, it can affect your health. It can affect your immune system. It can affect your kind of mental bandwidth to multitask and handle lots of different assignments under time pressures and the urgencies of work in these firms. And so that stress, that's a direct result of having to worry that people might treat you unfairly, makes what's already a pretty stressful job that much more stressful for people. And that can have any number of effects on you. But another result that it has, and this is another term that I made up, is racial reticence. And so if you're wondering, the reason why I make up so many terms here is that one of my audiences is fellow academics. And when you're writing for other academics, it's important that you kind of you name what you're talking about, and so that's kind of you have a claim on that concept. And so if people want to discuss this in the future, and I hope they do, they'll use that concept and they'll cite the book. So just want to let you all know, in real life, I don't go around just making up names for everything. But so here, I like the alliteration though. So racial reticence just sounds, it has a ring to it. But in any event, it's not a laughing matter, because this is something that can seem like a smart strategy. It's a very natural response to to stigma anxiety, but it can have these hidden consequences that a lot of people don't recognize until it's too late. So here, this is an attorney that I interviewed, who I call Kim here. And Kim is explaining why she and some other Black attorneys, associates at her firm, did not actively speak up much in meetings. So racial reticence is a way of referring to the kind of decision to not speak up or speak out in certain situations because of your concerns that your words are going to be treated unfairly. So in other words, if you're in a meeting and you're worried that some of the partners are going to be extra critical of anything that you say, judge any kind of grammatical errors or any kind of factual slips as a sign that you're not smart or you're not competent, then you're going to be more reluctant to speak. And so this is one strategy that some people try to use. They make sure that they only speak when they're 100% right. That when they know for a fact that whatever they say is going to be received, or at least can't be criticized. And so that might seem like a sensible strategy, but there can be downsides. Because at these firms, in some instances, speaking up is a way to signal certain things about yourself that can be valuable to convey to your senior professional colleagues who don't know you that well. So if you're at team meetings, that's your chance to shine by showing how smart you are, how articulate you are, how enthusiastic and engaged you are, just how lovely you are to be around, whatever it is. That's your opportunity to signal certain things to your senior colleagues. And when you engage in this kind of reticence, you make it that much, you're kind of missing out on that opportunity. So it's a calculated risk for some people, but a lot of people aren't aware of this downside. So Kim explained that she actually got negative performance reviews because she just didn't speak up as much as some of the guys on her team, some of the white guys on her team. And another example of this occurs when somebody gets a tricky assignment. So sometimes you get an assignment and you have no idea where to start. I can tell you this as an attorney. You have to turn to somebody else and say, what does this partner really want? What am I supposed to do with this? And if you're worried, some people understandably don't want to ask those questions because you don't want to be judged as being less intelligent than everyone else. You don't want people to think that you need your hand held. So what happens is, as Susan explained, is that rather than asking questions or being able to say, I don't know, we hide and struggle on our own. We work doubly hard on challenging assignments, trying to figure out on our own, because we aren't comfortable saying, I don't understand, because we think the consequences might be different for Black people. So, perfectly understandable. But the downside here is that when you don't ask for clarification or help, it takes you longer to do the assignment. and it increases the chance that you're not going to do a great job on it. So it's really, again, if you're in that situation, it's arguably a no-win situation, because I don't want to say no-win, but there are dangers on both sides. If you ask for help, you might be judged. If you don't ask for help, you might end up in the situation Susan was in, where she started getting negative reviews. And the reviews are, it takes you too long to do some of these assignments, or you make avoidable mistakes. And we question whether you're a team player, because again, she's not really communicating. She's off on her own. And so those types of reviews, they might not seem like they're terrible, terrible reviews, but when you're in that situation and you're working in this kind of competitive environment, that signals to you that you are not on the right path. And so even some of these reviews that might seem like they're minor criticisms, if you're in that situation, I need to really make some changes or get out of here. And at some point, as they start to accumulate, you realize you don't have a chance. You're not going to be partner there no matter what happens. And it's time to move on. And so that's what happened with Susan. She ended up leaving the firm shortly after our interview. And also, I think she ended up leaving the practice of law, basically. She took a job where law was sort of a law degree helped, but wasn't necessary. She wasn't practicing law. And another kind of adaptive response that some people take when they're dealing with stigma anxiety is what I call self-concealment. And so self-concealment occurs when you try to not to divulge personal information to your colleagues, because you feel that they won't understand, or they'll judge you for it, or they'll listen to what you say through some kind of stereotyped lens. And this is also pretty common. So this is just one person I interviewed who I felt fit this description. I call her Maria. And Maria explains, I don't talk about anything personal with them being her white colleagues. Ironically, I'm reading this book by Carla Harris. And Carla Harris is a famous, big-time, and I guess works at an investment bank on Wall Street. I was blanking on the investment bank, but a very well-known senior Black professional woman who's inspired a lot of people. And Morgan Stanley? Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember if it was Morgan Stanley or JP, and I didn't want to get them mixed up. So, but Carla Harris wrote this book a while back, and this woman happened to be reading it. And she's saying, I'm reading this book, and Carla Harris is explaining that Black women put up a wall. We only want to show you this much of us, so we're not going to engage in that type of conversations that would then allow us to have those types of personal relationships. So she says, part of that would be my fault. So she's blaming herself here. And I think they're in the book, when people blame themselves, I actually try to defend them against themselves and say, well, wait a minute, it's a difficult situation. So it's important that people don't look at this as some kind of just personal flaw on her part. But in any event, she recognizes from what she's reading how the strategy that she's been engaging in could backfire. And so there are other people I talked to too who also had similar experiences and similar perspectives. And there are other people who observe that in their colleagues. So they might not do this themselves, but they might have a coworker who they know outside of work, and they can see the difference. They can see how lively and energetic someone is in their regular life and how they change up in the office, and how that doesn't actually help them in the long run. And so the other type, remember, there are two main types of racial discomfort. One is stigma anxiety, the other is social alienation. And social alienation refers to the isolation and marginalization that many Black professionals experience because their backgrounds and cultural repertoires differ from those of their white colleagues. And so that's just a long-winded way of saying it's the isolation you experience because you don't quite fit in, and you feel that you don't fit in. You feel that your colleagues are different than you. You don't understand some of the frames of reference that come up in the office small talk. You don't want to hang out with them after work when they go do what they do. You know, these are all types of social alienation. And this might sound trivial to people because this isn't actually directly related to the work you perform. But as I've mentioned, at these firms, relationships matter. So if this is part of the career path, if you're attempting to advance in these firms, one way to do that is to take the time to develop these relationships. And this prevents people from developing those relationships because they don't feel comfortable having to negotiate these interactions and these social events and happy hours on the cultural terms of their colleagues. So I'll give you some examples of that, but this is basically the flip side of a well-known social dynamic called homophily. Well, it's well-known among academics. Nobody else has ever heard of the term homophily. But so homophily just is a fancy way of saying that people who are similar tend to like each other and gravitate toward each other. That's what it refers to. It's I guess a 70-year-old sociological theory at this point. It's pretty well established. You can see this in all areas of life. And so, but the thing is that we've all heard the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. But in some instances, if you're one of the only birds that doesn't have that feather, life is pretty lonely. And in an environment where relationships are so important, that can be a really big disadvantage. And so that's what I get at here with social alienation. So they're basically, this is affecting the people who are the birds with a different feather. And in the book, when I talk about culture, I mean that very broadly. So the way we talk about culture, it refers to essentially all types of recreational and leisure interests people have. So it doesn't have to be like high culture and art and the fine arts. Culture also refers to your nightlife preferences, believe it or not, the types of establishments you like to spend your after hours time at, your sports interests. Do you like golf? Do you like basketball? Do you play either? Do you like talking about them? Do you like attending events? The TV shows you watch. So I point this out in the book. A lot of people don't realize this, but even among the Real Housewives shows, there's a real racial divide in who watches what. So I don't want to overgeneralize, but Black people tend to watch. I'm sure you can get, if any of you are familiar with the franchises, watch Potomac and Roa, Real Housewives of Atlanta. And non-Black audiences tend to watch those the least and watch the other episodes. So there are really big differences here. And this goes back to the 90s where Seinfeld and Friends were major, major hits among white viewers. We're not in the top 50 most watched Black shows. So there are lots of these subtle little differences that, again, can seem trivial, but they can really affect your interactions in the workplace. The talk around the cooler, what you end up doing after work, where you go. If you're at a place that loves dive bars and you'd rather be at the club or a nice lounge, then that's a real discomfort for a lot of people. So in any event, just to talk about that, I'll give one example in the interest of time. I've been talking too much, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. I'll speed up even more, I should say. So you see this in social outings, as I mentioned. And this is a lawyer that I interviewed who's complaining. And he's actually someone he's capable of dealing with this, but he recognizes that it's a problem. And he's very frustrated when I interviewed him. And so part of my language, there's a curse word here, but he's explaining that there's another layer of complication, stress, almost like another layer of the job that you have to go through if you're not comfortable. For example, if you don't like to go out and drink beer, there's small annoyances. If you go to a firm event, you know there's going to be shitty music. That's just the way it is. And he says you ignore it, but why should you? Why is it that there are only certain genres? And so he explains that this can be frustrating, one, because it's unenjoyable, but two, once you start to think about it, it's like, why do we always have to do it on their terms? And so that's what he's getting at here. There's that multiple layers of how this can be a disadvantage. And this also happens in small talk. So another lawyer that I interviewed explained that if you don't play golf, you can't form relationships with certain people as easily. or maybe not even play, but like be familiar with the terminology and the professionals who play or who had played. And he's just saying he can't contribute to those conversations. And he felt that conversations like that in part determine who gets close to whom. And so it could be other factors as well. It could be just race itself, could be just gender itself. But in his opinion, from his perspective, being able to be a part of these conversations matters. And so I don't mention it in this quote, but he explained that one way that he was able to connect with some of these older white men was by talking about basketball. So he did follow that sport, and there were partners who were into basketball. So it just goes to show, and of course that can be a disadvantage to people who aren't into basketball either. So it just goes to show that some of these seemingly minor, trivial things can affect you professionally. And so I want to circle back, if you can remember, Sandra and Deborah, the two women who worked at the same firm. And I want to talk about why they might have had different experiences. Now, I can't prove this. Obviously, it's impossible to tell. There's so many factors that determine who succeeds and who doesn't. If anyone tries to tell you which specific factor it was, don't trust them. But I'll say in general, based on the totality of my interviews, I found a number of distinctions between those who succeeded and those who didn't. And they do fit to some extent Sandra and Deborah. So to succeed, you obviously need to be able to perform excellent work, and you need to be able to do it again and again and again and again. And that's just something that's non-negotiable. That's in these firms, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You also need relationships. And sometimes those relationships arise naturally from your work performance, but they don't always. So all the people I interview who were very successful had these relationships, and most of them knew at least one colleague who they thought performed very well, but just did not get that kind of support. So they didn't think that they were just better than everyone. Well, one person I interviewed definitely thought she was better than everyone. And maybe she was, I don't know. But most of them were pretty humble, and they said, I do very good work, but so does she, and she's not getting hooked up the way I'm getting hooked up. So some of this brings me to the third item, which is chance. We underestimate this as researchers, but chance plays a major role sometimes in determining your life path or your career path. So if you were fortunate enough to get hooked up with the right partner and to get the right assignment at the right point early in your career, that can make all the difference. So within a year on the job, you can be in a very different trajectory than if you had had the misfortune of being assigned to work on a case with a less beneficial partner. So, but the one concept I want to introduce before I run out of time is that of white familiarity. So as you might guess, this is a term I invented. And it refers to the comfort that some people enjoy in these settings because of their prior life experiences. And specifically, people who've had positive relationships and high quality, close relationships with white friends and their family members and authority figures, and people who've had these close social relationships and who are used to being the only Black person socializing in certain settings. For these people, being in that environment in the workplace is just fundamentally different than for those people who didn't have that kind of background. And again, it doesn't make them better, but it's just an advantage in this specific setting. And so Deborah, for example, had grown up in a pretty segregated, predominant, almost exclusively Black, I don't want to say the city, but a neighborhood in a major city. And she had all Black friends. And even when she went on to a more diverse high school and college, she gravitated toward the Black communities there. And she had negative experiences at college and interacting with some of her white peers and people on her floor, her dorm floor. And so she's somebody who had a very different background when it comes to having to try to thrive in these types of settings. Sandra, on the other hand, had grown up in an all-white suburb where all of her best friends in childhood were white, or I'll say non-Black, most of them were white. And she just had a very different perspective on race as a part of that, partly because of that. So it was that much easier for her to enter the firm world and strike up these conversations with these 55-year-old white men who had the key to her career. I have a lot more to say about that, but in the interest of time, because I really do want to give everyone a chance to ask questions, I'm going to end there, and hopefully I'll be able to say more in the question and answer.
We have time for about 10 to 15 minutes of your questions. We do have folks watching back home. It's a hybrid program, so if you have a question, if you could bring it to that microphone or this microphone, it would be appreciated.
And if there aren't any questions, I can ask myself questions and answer those. Those are some of the best questions.
Good evening. How long did it take you to do your research?
So the actual interviews or the entire project?
The entire project.
I don't even want to think about it because it's a sad answer. I would say in total, I began working on this in 2009. So, and the book is just coming out now. But I don't want everyone, I don't want that to scare anyone. If you're trying to do research on your own, it doesn't have to take that long. I did other things. It was kind of an on-off thing. But the reason it took so long was that obviously once I became a professor, I had to publish other types of articles so that I could get tenure. And so that took away from my time working on the book. And also it was really difficult for me actually to figure out how to organize these concepts that I was coming across in my interviews. So it all comes together. It looks neat and tidy when it's on page and when I give it like a fancy name. But in real time, I'm getting all these experiences from all these people, and I'm trying to connect the dots, and I'm trying to figure out the kind of core threads and also what's going to be interesting to people to read about. And so that took a whole lot of time. So it ended up being more than a decade-long project. Thank you.
Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for
wanted to
coming.
say that. We just got the book, so like I haven't read it yet. So I just wanted to ask a question where it says why some Black professionals starve. Is there a part in the book that talks about people who notice the elephant in the room being racism, but just don't care about it?
Who noticed the elephant in the room of
like the racism, I guess the weight of the racism that they could face in the office, but just don't care. They just focus on the work.
Yeah, so a couple things I'll say about that. Absolutely. So I think, I don't want to overgeneralize. People like Sandra the woman who I mentioned who became partner, would say, yeah, there are some racists here. And she even shared some stories. There was a partner who assumed that she was there to that she was the legal assistant he had worked with earlier that day and didn't recognize her and was trying to get her to do something to help with his computer. She had another partner who acted blown away that she did a good job in an assignment where he said, "You write so well." And she took that to reveal that he had low expectations for her. But her perspective is, I can't do anything about that. The only thing that I have in my control is doing really good work, making an effort to cultivate the relationships, and covering making sure that doesn't slip in front of the wrong people. But at the same time, really just having the self-confidence to say, if I'm going to make it here, it's going to be by working hard and putting myself out there. So I would say absolutely. And there are other people I interviewed who were successful who shared similar stories. I hope I answered your question. Yeah, so they're not all naive and thinking that life is just perfect there. Some of them really, there's another guy to add to that response who wasn't getting good work. So he realized that he had to work way more than everyone else to get that work. So he ended up billing more than 3,000 hours a year, multiple years in a row. And he said it. He said, I wasn't getting, don't be scared, any of you future lawyers here. He's an extreme case. But his philosophy was, I can't control, the only thing I can control is doing more work if that's going to get me the assignments that I need. And so in addition to the work he was doing that he was assigned, he would actively seek out more opportunities from other people on top of that. and eventually he made, I guess, non-equity partner. Then he ended up leaving. So it was, I guess, at least somewhat of a success story. Most people didn't even make non-equity partner, but even then, it took a toll. Like he came close to experiencing really serious burnout. He got sick at some point, but he was blunt. He did what he could.
Hi. Would you ever consider like expanding the reach of your study to maybe include like other post-MBA roles like private equity, FANG, or even like Supreme Court clerks, like sort of all in that same category of like very demanding, very lacking Black spaces that can be very white?
Yeah, so I would love to. One of the challenges with this study is I actually had a couple people who worked in private equity, but I couldn't use one of them because I eventually had to narrow it down to jobs that were very similar in terms of like the career hierarchy and structure. But to expand upon the question, there are lots of settings like this, and not just in these like extremely, I guess you would just say, high status occupations. There are lots of settings where to be a Black person working in that environment is to be one of few or maybe one of one. And these types so for example, there was somebody I worked with somebody I knew, a friend of the family who worked in construction. And he shared similar stories. When he found out what my research was about, he said, yeah, it's the same in construction where the people who are in tight with I don't know if it was the foreman or whatever the higher up was, the ones who go out for drinks, the ones who are always talking like on their shift, they're the ones who get ahead. So I was actually interested in expanding the study that way as well. But to answer your question though, the challenge with studying just like clerks, Supreme Court clerks or private equity is just finding enough people who would be willing to talk. But I would certainly love to at some point.
Hi, good evening. I have a question going back to where you last left off with the white family part. And I forgot which one you were talking about that related more to the older white men. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate more on that, please?
Sure. So one thing I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to elaborate. That was a calculated gamble right there. But the one thing I want to say about that is it's not sufficient. And I don't want to, it's always the challenge when you write a book like this is to make it seem as if this is the answer. So the people who have this are going to thrive. The people who don't are going to suffer. That's not the case at all. I just want to be clear about that. This is me just connecting the dots and observing patterns and developing theories that other people are going to have to test even more in the future. So the thing about this white familiarity concept is that because these firms are white spaces, people who have more acclimation to those spaces have advantages over those who don't. So that's really what it's about in a nutshell. It's not fair. And obviously it has a disparate effect on Black professionals, especially depending on your background. But it can be beneficial to the extent that it makes you that much more able to develop relationships or to enjoy spending time with them. So there are people I interviewed, for example, who even ones who weren't absolute superstars would say, there were plenty of attorneys here who were more impressive than me, but because I was in tight with these guys and I went out for drinks with them on a regular basis after work, I got certain looks and certain opportunities that those other people who were better lawyers than me didn't get. And one thing that I wish I could talk more about is the elephant in the room is gender. This really has a very negative effect on women. And there's some of the women I interviewed said, I never ever say this, Kevin, but in my firm, it's gender more than race. So, but that's a story for another day, I suppose.
Well, we're going to take this last question from our online audience, and I think it's apropos to what you just left off with. Question, are you able to speak on any notable differences between Black male and female professionals? Experience tells me that Black men more typically thrive in these environments, and I wonder why.
Okay. So I always hate to like pat myself on the back, but I am psychic, if any of you will wonder. Yeah, there are differences. I don't want to overgeneralize, though, but I do think that there are some situations where, and this is the kind of the classic scenario where men may have certain advantages. And again, I could talk for an hour just about gender and about how Black women have it significantly worse than Black men in these particular firms for those reasons on average. And it's because the way the social dynamics work, when you have these informal get-togethers, in many instances at these firms, you have to keep in mind, these are firms that are in pretty cosmopolitan big cities, so a lot of DC, New York firms. These people, it's not as conspicuous for them to have like one Black person in the group as it might be to have 7 men and 1 woman. Especially some of these people are intentionally excluding women because they want to be able to act and behave in certain ways that they wouldn't feel comfortable acting in front of some of their female colleagues. But others, it's an inadvertent exclusion. They might just decide they know these guys are into football, so they don't even think to figure out who else might be interested in football or going to the game with them. They just decide that they're going to go to a bar together and watch the game or go over to someone's house. So that can really work to the disadvantage of women. One person that I spoke to about my research, this wasn't actually in my study, but it would have been if I'd met her sooner, but she was sharing that at her job, there were senior men who would take out a bunch of the junior guys to golf on Fridays. And everyone else would just be stuck in the office doing work while these guys are literally out golfing, drinking, and bonding. So you can only imagine. And I was shocked that that was happening at a pretty major management consulting firm. But so you can only imagine the effect that that's going to have. But I will say this, and again, my study is not a representative sample. So the fact that I found a bunch of very successful Black women doesn't mean, actually more successful Black women than Black men. That doesn't mean that that's how it is in real life. But the ones that I interviewed, to get ahead, they had to form relationships with senior white men. And they were fortunate enough to be able to do that, in part because they were just amazing in terms of how they did their jobs and their personalities and white familiarity, if you take my view on it, helped them do so. But it's an uphill battle, and a lot of extremely talented, extremely impressive women just don't get that opportunity.
I want to take the opportunity to thank our author this evening, Kevin Woodson. So Kevin's going to have time to sign your books. We'll be right outside. My colleague Sophia over by the doors will be in the front of the line. She'll help everybody with their books. Again, our bookseller is Urban Reads this evening, so please purchase a book. If you didn't get a chance to ask Kevin a question, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to talk to you outside. We'll be out there in about 5 minutes. Thanks.